from the Mutual Broadcasting System. This is STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. Now, retired Marine Intelligence Officer and globally recognized risk expert Hal Kempfer.
Welcome to STRAT, our Strategic Risk Assessment Talk, and I'm going to talk about the possibility, some might even say probability, of putting U.S. boots on the ground in Iran. And we'll talk about where those boots might go and what those boots might be doing. All right, but there's some big things that have changed, not the least of which is the first of two Marine Expeditionary Units have arrived in the theater of operations in the Persian Gulf area. First one is the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit out of Japan. They have arrived. A very capable force, about 2,200 total Marines. It's got a ground force component of about 800 Marines built around a Marine Infantry Battalion. They are in there. And then the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit out of San Diego departed a while back. They're steaming from San Diego across the Pacific and the Indian Ocean to the Persian Gulf. They should be there, I'm going to say maybe in about a week or so. That's a lot of Marine Corps power, if you will, combat power that can be put in there. And then another thing that's in there is what's called the Immediate Response Force. This is something that is currently under the 82nd Airborne Division that they have. Initially, it was set about 3,000. So it sounded like it was built around an Army brigade. The first 1,000 soldiers are either in theater or going to theater. It really is kind of vague as far as where they are physically at this point in time. But I will say this, with 1,000, we can airlift that in pretty fast. So I'm not sure. They could be already there. And that's a tremendous capability because Airborne, amongst the many things that an Airborne can do, is they do something called advanced airfield seizures. Way back when, I saw how they do these advanced airfield seizures where they parachute in, they basically jump in a battalion or two battalions or whatever they have to seize the airfield. And it is truly, certainly from a light infantry perspective, truly a remarkable thing that they are able to do very well. So when you look at a lot of the places that we might do something in and around Iran, if we did put boots on the ground, like big raids or something, that's a tremendous capability they have. Now, not only that 3,000 that is eventually going to get in there, but another 10,000 have been announced as being prepared to deploy in theater. So that's a lot of combat power. That's a whole capability set that the commander of U.S. Central Command just did not have before. So it gives them options to do things on the ground, not just from the air, options to reinforce some of those strike missions. And keep in mind, over pretty much almost all of Iran, or at least certainly most of Iran, we have what's called air dominance. Not air supremacy, but air dominance. What that means is whatever force we put on the ground is backed up by a tremendous airstrike capability. And as someone who has served in a variety of units where we control close air support, you would be surprised how a very small unit with a lot of great air support can really dominate the battle space. So that's something that we have that makes us kind of unique in that regard. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't remind everybody, the coast of Iran is really long. I mean, it goes all the way up, the Persian Gulf up to Iraq, all the way down across the entire Persian Gulf, and then shoots out across the Gulf of Oman, the Indian Ocean area, all the way to Pakistan. And you say, well, that's very impressive, but what does that mean? That means you got to defend a lot of coastline. That means for Iran, they're looking at this massive coastline. They're looking at all these forces that are coming in. And it's not that there's enough forces to invade Iran and march on Tehran and destroy the Revolutionary Guard Corps and the regular army. What it means is they have to spread their forces way out to try and protect this massive coastline. And by the way, the massive coastline is really almost a sideshow, except for the Strait of Hormuz, to the fact that the nuclear weapons and a lot of other things are much further inland. So it's a real security, it's a defensive challenge, if you will, for the Iranians. And that's what we've done with a relatively small composition of forces. we have now put a tremendous burden on them and figure out how they want to defend Iran against these types of raids. Now, there are about 7 islands that kind of hold the keys to the castle, if you will, for the Strait of Hormuz. And there is a potential plan that could establish Gulf control by focusing on these islands. This is not a big secret. Obviously, Iran knows about this. They've probably been planning for it for 47 years. And so there's a lot of things that are being looked at. Obviously, Kharg Island has been in the news a lot. It's further up north of the Persian Gulf. It is an island that is kind of the energy hub of the northern Persian Gulf. About 90% of Iran's oil exports pass through Kharg Island. Now, there's another a newer facility that was down on the Gulf of Oman. It's not as capable. It cannot pump as much oil through there. That was set up in 2021. And I would say if it ever became an issue, we could literally go in with an airstrike and wipe that thing out, and it wouldn't really matter. But Kharg Island is, on the one hand, it is the crown jewel of their energy export industry. And as some have said, it is also the Achilles heel of their energy export industry because it is so susceptible to attack and to being destroyed should that ever happen. And so that is something that's been in the news a lot. As interesting as that is, and as much focus as Kharg Island gets, I would take you a little bit further south to say some other islands that could even be more important as they directly affect shipping as it goes through the Strait of Hormuz. And I say this because the Strait of Hormuz is this very narrow strait that basically that all ships have to go through to go in and out of the Persian Gulf. And that's 20% of the world's oil goes in and out of that Strait of Hormuz area. And it's narrow, and Iran is able to control it because, yes, they control one side, but more importantly, they control all these islands that permeate into the Strait of Hormuz. So these islands could be very, very important. And the 7 islands are sometimes called Iran's defensive arc in terms of its ability to control the Strait of Hormuz. Now, in 2022, there was a study looking at geography and the arrangement that allows Iran to control maritime traffic for the strait. Take a look at how large ships and tankers are basically forced to navigate so close to these islands and into these very shallow waters that Iran can control. Abu Musa is one of the larger of these very small islands that's out there. Greater and Lesser Toomb are also islands considered particularly critical, as they could be points where the Revolutionary Guard Corps can use its small speedboats to do mine laying, also potentially launch drones from. So these are all to include sea drones, not just aerial drones, but drones on the sea. And they have used unmanned surface vessels in this war. So this is not something I'm saying they hypothetically could do. They've actually been doing it. So that's absolutely crucial. Iranian officials describe these islands as basically bottomless aircraft carriers, kind of underscoring their strategic value. Why bottomless? Well, because you can't sink an island. And so it gives them a lot of value to that. And certainly the Revolutionary Guard Corps has been strengthening the defenses of these islands, probably digging a lot of stuff underground, you can well imagine, and looking at all the ways that an enemy would strike their bases and everything in the region, and how they could use that to strike other people's bases and ships and other things in the region as well. Now, according to a lot of analysts, for the U.S. to be able to secure passage of naval forces to the Persian Gulf, especially if we were going to do something like a landing operation at Kharg Island, we would have to neutralize these Iranian positions on these islands. Essentially, in some cases, we'd literally just have to take the islands themselves in order to make that happen. While everybody gets kind of focused on Kharg Island, I mean, yes, we can destroy it from the air, but if we want to take it, we got to work our way up the Persian Gulf, and there's other islands that are directly in the way of getting there. Now, it's estimated that 2 large landing units, like 2 large MEUs, could be used to provide the overwhelming power to take some of these islands, like Abu Musa, Greater and Lesser Toomb. Now, they could come in by air, they could come in by sea. And with a MEU, there's a lot of different capabilities there. There's a lot of different landing vehicles that they have. They also have, ribs and Zodiac boats that if they want to do a raid in that way, like a very clandestine, surreptitious raid, like a amphibious raid at night, sort of thing I used to do way back when. That's a possibility. There's also other larger islands, like Kingsham, as well as Hormuz, hence the Strait of Hormuz, named after Hormuz Island, and Larak and Keshem Island. Now, Keshem is huge. If you look into the strait, you'll see this big, long island on one side of the strait. That's Keshem Island. There's about 150,000 people live on Keshem Island. It's not like a desert island with nobody living there. But I would point out that the population, the inhabitants of Keshem Island, are predominantly Sunni Muslim, whereas the Revolutionary Guard Corps and Iran is the center of Shiite Islam. And I would say that the Sunni-Shia split thing is a lot more profound than a lot of other differences that you'll run into in the Middle East. In fact, as many have said, the Sunni-Shia split is a much bigger confrontation than anything that was ever aimed at Israel and the Jews in Israel versus Islam. So that is something that a potential Sunni occupation force, maybe say a really big country with a large military like Saudi Arabia, maybe that's something they could exploit. That would be something they could look at. So I'm just kind of pointing that out as something to think about in the background. Larak Island at the entrance to the strait is a very critical target. It's a little bit larger island than some of the others that are in there, but it's a place where Iran can strike ships. It's a place where Iran has been vectoring ships to avoid the international sea lanes to go up by Larak and Hormuz Island, and then they stop them, and they've been imposing like a $2 million fee to go through the Persian Gulf for these ships. So that's something they've been doing for a bit. You know, there's a lot of things the U.S. can do. The U.S. could launch airstrikes on these places, and I have no doubt that before we start putting boots on the ground anywhere, we're going to do a lot of stuff by the air first. By the way, before we put significant boots on the ground, we might want to put some special operations boots on the ground to do things like gather intelligence, sabotage, whatever it is, to soften up the target before we actually get there. So there's a lot of things that can be done in doing that, and it would deprive the Iranians of being able to control activity from those islands and deprive them of these bottomless aircraft carriers, these critical bases of operations. All right. Now, these islands, controlling these islands or maintaining control would require some sort of permanent occupation force after the island's actually been seized. And a lot of folks have looked at some of these islands. They say, well, it's going to be depending on the size island. It could be, 1,800, 2,000 troops, say on Larak Island or something like that. And you go, okay, that's a big pull. If you're talking that many forces, in terms of ground forces, that would be both the 31st and the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit just to maintain the ground troops on Larak, for example, if that was as much as it took. However, I want to point something out. Again, Saudi Arabia is there. Saudi Arabia has been saying, look, we want to get involved. The United Arab Emirates are there. The United Arab Emirates, among other things, there's 3 islands there I want to kind of point to, Abu Musa, Greater Toom, and Lesser Toom. They're all claimed as sovereign territory by the United Arab Emirates. They were seized by the Shah of Iran back in 1971. He had overwhelming combat forces. There was really not much the UAE could do about it, and he just took these islands by force, all right? The UAE has never relinquished their territorial claim to these islands. So if we were to say our Muse went in and took the islands, do they have to keep forces there to maintain occupation? I don't think so. I think there could be a passage of lines, where, so to speak, a maritime passage of lines, whatever, replacement. They could replace our forces and basically set up a UAE military presence on these islands to control these islands, because they actually do claim them as Saudi territory as well. Some of these other islands, I think Saudi Arabia would be very well suited to provide an occupation force. And by the way, I think both those countries could certainly probably be interested in maybe doing some sort of joint assault, if you will, beyond just occupation, actually joining with us and doing the assault. We've done that before in Desert Storm. We worked with the Gulf Coalition allies as a combined operation. They went up the coastline. We went around the big hook maneuver, if you recall. So there's a lot of possibilities there. And I do think that Saudi Arabia, particularly, they have an airborne brigade I've been looking at for a while that could very foreseeably do some sort of vertical envelopment, whether it's by parachute or some other means like helicopters or whatever, to do some stuff. So there are a lot of different ways that these islands could not just be assaulted, but also be occupied and held. And frankly, I don't think the U.S. wants to tie down its forces on these little islands for any particular amount of time. Go in there, do the shock troop assault, take the islands, and then we pull back and hand it over to the occupation force. Kind of like what the Marines do with the Army. If you want to go back historically, we would take these islands and then we'd hand them over to the Army to occupy them after we were gone. Now, these islands are not, taking these islands is not just reducing what you see above the ground. You go over, take pictures, and you look at the imagery, and you go, there's a building, there's this, there's that, and you can use those for strike missions. The problem with the Iranians is that they put a lot of stuff underground. On Keshem Island, for example, there are rumors that they have those famous underground missile cities on Keshem Island. And by the way, that is a massive island. There's no way in the world that with the forces we have, even the ground forces we have, that we're going to be able to take something the size of Keshem Island without working with our allies in the region, if that was ever something we wanted to do. And I'm not even sure we'd want to take the whole island. I think we'd just like to eliminate whatever Iran has there in order to eliminate their ability to fire missiles and drones or whatever else to impact shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. But these islands have a lot of stuff underground that needs to be addressed. By the way, that's one of the reasons you have ground forces go in, is because the ground forces can literally find the tunnel entrance and go in there and destroy whatever's underground. And that's something you can't always do from the air. So for the U.S. and its Gulf Cooperation Council allies to control those islands, they essentially need, they really do need to kind of go in there. If they want to take control of the Strait of Hormuz, or we want to take control of the Strait of Hormuz, we kind of need to work together on this. That just makes the most sense. And if you want to go up and take Kharg Island, we need to look at these other islands further south in the Strait of Hormuz to gain control of them so our forces can get up north to do something in Kharg Island if that's something we want to do. Now, just to remind you, 90% of the oil that comes out of Iran goes through there. So if we took Kharg Island, that would literally cut off the revenue source for the regime. So even if the people of Iran don't overthrow the regime right away, the regime, if we took Kharg Island, the regime would simply just run out of money. They got 1 million. They boast that they have 1 million men under arms. Well, that's great, but if you can't pay that 1 million men under arms, they're not going to be under arms for very much longer. So that's a big challenge that they have. Now, the U.S. learned a lot of tough lessons in World War II about seizing islands, lessons that deserve revisiting, particularly dealing with underground revetments, underground tunnels, underground positions, and then also recognizing that once you take the islands, Iran will use every drone, missile, whatever it has in its inventory to attack our forces on those islands. So these are a lot of things to think about. Also, that the Iranians have plenty of times to put minefields out there, set up booby traps, all sorts of stuff in place. And we may want to look at doing some stuff with robotics to maybe go in and clear some of these areas before we actually put our boots on the ground. And I would be remiss if I didn't remind everybody that Iran does have that big honking coastline. So before we get overly fixated on these islands, keep in mind there's a lot of other places that we could hit to really knock the IRGC off balance, to make them move their forces, to undermine public confidence that the IRGC is really up to the task of defending Iran. There's just a lot of things that can be done in the world of raids, and that's why you do raids a lot of times. If you go back to World War II, one of the reasons that England did some very famous, or Britain did some very famous raids, was to simply demonstrate that they could, that the Nazis couldn't defend a lot of these places, and to, basically build resolve within the British forces, but also to build public support and recognition that Britain has tremendous capabilities. Well, we could look at doing the same thing. Now, if Iran fortifies these islands to a certain point, then I would say we look at doing stuff at other ways or other locations. We just don't need to. We don't need. This is one thing that came out of Desert Storm. You don't need to go into the teeth of their defenses. You can go around them. You can circumvent them. You find where they're weak. You find where there's Achilles heel. You find where those centers of gravity are with the units, and then go after the center of gravity and not go after the main combat strength of the unit. There's just a lot of stuff. And I would say there's a lot of doomsayers out there. I'm not advocating for putting boots on the ground, but I am saying there's a lot of doomsayers out there that kind of make some unqualified judgments. They don't understand amphibious operations. They don't understand maneuver warfare. And they just kind of look at this as if it's some sort of math game. You know, it's like, well, they got 1 million and you've only got 17,000, so there's no way you could win. Okay, that means absolutely nothing. I mean, we were outnumbered 2-1 with the Iraqis during Desert Storm, and we blasted through them like a hot knife through butter. I mean, it was 100 hours. We took Kuwait. It is not a linear math equation, all right? There's a lot of stuff either. When it comes to doing amphibious operations, it comes to doing amphibious raids, nobody knows that better than the Marine Corps. And when it comes to doing the advanced airfield seizures using airborne forces, Airborne are some of the smartest guys. They are the smartest guys, I'd argue, on the planet on how to do these big advanced airfield seizure things. So they're there. They know how. They planned. I've done Army planning, Marine Corps planning process with looking at operations like this, and they trust me. Our forces know how to do this stuff. So before anybody gets out there and starts poo-pooing it, thinking they understand this stuff, I would say that's fine. Just take a little time, do Marine Corps Command and Staff College or CGSC with the Army or something. Learn the planning process, learn how we plan these things out and do these things before anyone jumps to conclusions. All right, so there's a lot of capabilities that are now in theater that weren't there before, and capabilities coming in theater that weren't there before. And these are capabilities that can put boots on the ground in some very unique ways. This is not going to be a replay of Desert Storm or Iraqi freedom. This is very different. And it's not going to be a replay of Venezuela with Maduro, and it's not going to be a replay of Midnight Hammer or anything like that. If we had a replay of that, I think we've already done that replay. But it is something that could put a significant capability and really change what's happening in the war very quickly. Thanks for listening to Strat. Also, please visit stratpodcast.com. Check out my YouTube channel at Kempfer TV. Or you can always go to my corporate website at Global Risk Intelligence and Planning, gripsa.com. And then also, I think they're doing a encore running of my last Global Threat Update on the InfraGard Los Angeles InfraGard website. That's infragardlosangeles.org. So please avail yourselves if you're interested, although I will be the first to say that information is getting a little more dated every single day.